Get going. Good morning to most of you. Danny Nelms, CEO at Work Institute. Excited for you all to be here today for our HR Professionals webcast series, Career Pathways, the Necessary Frontier in Employee Retention. Some of you that may have been with us last week, I announced that my good friend Kim now would be joining me. Like all good consultants, she had an urgent matter with a client, so I am honored to be joined today by Kevin Richie. And Kevin is a great person to be on this. His last three roles have really had a lot to do with this as a talent leader in a healthcare organization, a couple of healthcare organizations. So really excited to have Kevin. Kevin, anything you would say about yourself to do a quick introduction?
No, glad to be with all of you. Got a talent management background, as Danny has said, been around the block a few times on this topic, so happy to be helpful in any way I can. So thanks, Danny.
Terrific. So as we always do, the first thing we want to do is jump into the data. Most of you are probably aware that we have now launched our 2025 retention report, and it's been out now for a couple of weeks. I hope all of you have downloaded that retention report by now. And one of the things that we've gone back to this year is really tackling some of the truths in employee retention. I think we have 11 of those truths. And one of the truths that remains is that career issues are still the number one reason for leaving. They have been for 14 consecutive years. And as you can see by the chart that I'm showing, it hovers right around 19, 20, 21%. So basically, 2 out of every 10 people that leave your organization are leaving because of some sort of career issue or career opportunity. When we break that down a little more granularly, this is what we start to see. We've got development opportunities, and we typically define development opportunities as developing within your current job, upskilling, those type of things. That's really how we're defining that lack of development. Obviously, some people want to get into a completely different career, and we typically define that as being pretty significant, meaning I'm going to go from being an accountant to now being a nurse, very different career. As opposed to, say, maybe a nurse that's working in a hospital and going into a physician practice would not be a different career. It would be a different job. Promotion is obviously there. A lot of, fair amount of folks go back to school, and then we have job security. Kevin, it looks like, we've had a pretty significant reduction around development over the last couple of years. Do you have any sense of, are companies and organizations investing more in helping to just put some of that development in place for current employees in order to help them to upskill and help them to develop? Is that something that you think you're seeing out there?
I've certainly noticed it, because after 14 years, you can't ignore the data much longer and do well. So you're seeing a lot of initiatives around internal universities. You're seeing some career ladders on the healthcare side. And certainly, as we continue to develop technology, just having some in-house self-paced learning tools are becoming more prominent. At least that's been my observation in some of the organizations I've been with.
Just as that's declining, we're actually seeing promotion as a reason for leaving to actually increase. Typically, I feel like this is a difficult one sometimes, but I think as we see some of the economic conditions we've had for the last 12 to 18 months, I think a lot of times people start to see stagnation in what they can see within their own company. And so they start to jump to other companies in order to gain that, career promotion. Does that seem pretty consistent with what you're kind of thinking and what you see?
Agree. And despite the headlines around some of these larger companies doing layoffs, what I'm seeing in the small to medium size range is that those folks are placing bets that they're going to grow. And so that's creating a higher title in a smaller company for some of these folks that have been displaced. So you're seeing that move as an opportunity to grow their careers.
Yeah. And then, we're always going to have some folks going back to school. We've got a fairly significant client base in healthcare, and I think you do see that a lot in healthcare, where you've got folks that are coming in as like a CNA or you know, um, not a registered nurse yet. I can't think of the title of
Yeah,
it.
LPNs. Yeah,
LPN, thank you.
LPNs. Yep.
Appreciate it. Coming in as an LPN and going back to school and being a nurse. So, and that's stayed pretty consistent from the most part. And we're going to jump into the different career a little bit more as we go along. But again, Work Institute, we're always trying to, and Kevin, I appreciate you mentioning it. So much of it starts with data. Do we have the data supporting what we need to do in our organizations to improve retention? And in a lot of the clients that we support, we see these career issues coming up, and we see them as their number one issue. And I think there's more that we can do, and that's certainly a big part of what we want to talk about today. So I think we start with this idea of having, actually creating a visible and structured career progression. And I see, I think about this all the time because, you ride around town and you see the help wanted signs, and you see, career development available or career opportunities available. But I think we say that, but then in terms of what we're actually doing in the company, I'm not sure how well we're actually setting those expectations and showing people exactly what that career map could look like. Kevin, why do you think it's so difficult for companies to really attack this issue in their organization?
Outside of your normal, in a world of limited resources answer, frankly, I think it's because we don't do a good job of studying the roles within the organization. So I love that visual, that little icon on this dot point, because uh, a couple organizations ago was in a call center type setting, and we literally had signs on the wall that looked very much like that, where in the call centers we would have, a representative, that's your starting gate. And then you would have paths into supervisor of a team, training and development, some other paths. But all of that starts with job analysis and really looking at what are the core key knowledge, skills, abilities, KSAs for the IO nerds like me, that constitute not just that role there at the bottom of those arrows, but also the roles that are adjacent to it. How can I go up? How can I go sideways? Uh, that all starts with job analysis, and you can start to identify what those key KSAs are and which ones can be stretched as you go through that career path. And so I think many organizations either don't invest in that step in the process. They say, oh, I've got a job description. That's my job analysis. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. There are, IO psychology nerds like me out there in the field available. If you're in the Tennessee area, MTSU can send grad students in to help you with that. And also with our AI tool friends these days, you can get the basics and band-aid something together to at least get a basic job analysis. And then that helps you to know which paths are really viable in your company to start to create those career paths.
Kevin, because you said it can be complex, and I think you're absolutely right that it can be. I think my perception when I'm talking to clients is that it seems overwhelming, that it seems like this is going to take a long time. It is going to be a lot of work. But I also see when I'm in companies that, it doesn't have to be everything at once either, because typically within an organization, from a career development standpoint, you typically also have a handful of core roles that are absolutely necessary in your organization. So if you're in healthcare, for example, nurses, right? I think
Yeah.
the number I see most often is that healthcare is made up of about 40% nurses, something in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to have some sort of career progression or career lattice for nurses. Do you think that people see it and almost make it too big in order to sort of start with some of those core roles?
Yeah. And let me just go back briefly to the previous question. It's very easy. Now, I have worked for imperfect organizations, and I'm sure everyone on the call works for perfect companies. But in those imperfect ones, they say, well, we don't pay enough.
Right.
Even when our data says it's career pathing is the reason why people are leaving, uh, we'll just use the pay enough solution band-aid to try to fix why they're leaving. So that's, to me, that's uh, using a grill to fry an egg when you've got a skillet right in front of you. Um, so that said, yeah, it's progress over perfection. And the example you laid out is exactly what I've seen in healthcare organizations. This often takes the form of a nursing ladder. So you start with your nurses because,
Hmm.
yeah, they're going to be between 25 and 40% of your workforce. And every company will have those key roles. Every company will have those inevitable naysayers that say, well, gosh, they always start with nurses. Um, but it's progress, and folks in those adjacent roles can see that it's progress, see that the organization is investing. And why not start with a key role?
Hmm.
Start somewhere rather than try to get it perfect before you launch the whole thing for every role. That's really not reasonable, nor is it a good return on your investment. Go for those roles that are really core and key to driving your business, and you can handle with the one-offs and explain the why. So yeah, I've in my most recent organization, we started with nursing and a nursing ladder. So you go from an LPN to an RN, RN, well, ASN, so an
Hmm.
associate's in nursing. Then you go to a bachelor's in nursing. Then you go to a master's in nursing, so on and so forth. And there were financial incentives in that structure. But the very next role we did was physical therapy, and then we did another role. So start small, get your systems down, and really get progress over perfection as your mantra.
And by the way, I should have mentioned this at the outset, but clearly our kind of our style in today's webcast is for me to ask Kevin a lot of questions, but I invite you to ask questions as well. So feel free to use the Q&A button in the meeting and throw out some questions for either myself or Kevin. We'd have to be thrilled to continue to answer those as we go through. So um, Kevin, one of the things that I think in doing that, and we see this all the time in organizations, is that we also don't communicate well, right? And to your point about sometimes you have to start with that one key role and you want others to see it. But how important is just not just the communication to the roles that are affected by it, but also just communicating to the organization as a whole that there are efforts underway to create career opportunities, to create career paths, to create those more direction in terms of how employees can advance or upskill or continue to stay with the organization.
Yeah, hugely critical. If if our audience members, if you have a competent partner like Work Institute, who can give you the data, the key with anything from an engagement perspective is you said and we did. So you,
Mhm.
as the workforce, told us X was an issue, and we, as the employer, responded to that feedback and are doing something about it. Even if it's small, it's going to be a win because it's going to show them, show your organization that you care about what they're talking about.
So when we think about internal mobility, and I think of mobility in terms of two things, but I really think about that mobility as attacking this different career issue. That we have people in our organization that want career mobility. And in thinking about that, it's like, I may be an accountant, but I actually would love to try sales. I see companies really struggling with this in terms of just maybe not being creative enough, not being open minded enough, maybe just not having enough conversations. And we're going to talk about that in a minute in terms of the manager employee conversations. But what do you think am I right in that this is a real challenge for organizations? And two, how do we get more creative? How do we get more thoughtful around how do we create more career mobility for people to try different things or do different things within their same company?
Yeah, that's a great question. A couple of thoughts. I think one, use your data. Um, and what I mean by that is there are, of any, I guess, small to medium sized organization, there should be data that you already have in your HR platform that shows how people are moving through the organization. Now, some of that might be uh, political. That's always going to be some noise in the data, but a good amount of it's going to show you where some natural paths are
Mhm.
that may not be expected. So I'll give you an example. In our last organization I was a part of, we noticed that our best salespeople were clinicians.
Hmm.
Now, our practice had been to recruit in non-clinicians into that sales role, that sales and growth role. But as we started looking at the data of outcomes, lo and behold, the clinicians were the best ones to share that information with the client, who are often clinical in their perspective. So we started hiring differently.
Hmm.
But that data told us, hey, we could make some lateral moves from our clinical team to our sales and growth team and need less effort from an external basis to fill those roles. So your data is there. It will often tell you where those internal paths are. And then once you've seen that sort of internal, informal movement, then you can create that icon there on that first dot point and say, hey, here's a real path. We've seen it already in our data. Now we can put some structure around it. Maybe that nurse who became a great salesperson has some attributes about her that were different than others. Then maybe we could do some learning and development for those folks that don't have that skill in our clinical team. Communications, closing the sale, some of those things, unpeeling the onion of the customer need. You can build structure around that from a learning and development perspective.
But do you think there's still a reluctance? And let's take your example, right? So I've got a clinician that wants to move into a sales and growth role. We're going to assume for a minute that they don't come into it with some of the traditional sales tactics and skills that we're typically looking for. Um, so I think there's probably the sense that it's going to take this person longer to get up to speed, as opposed to going external and hiring someone who has those skills and has been doing a sales or growth role.
Sure.
How do you think we get companies and organizations to think differently about that? Because and from my seat, and obviously from a work institute perspective, if that person leaves, if that clinician leaves because they see the opportunity elsewhere to go do that, then there's a cost of turnover there, right? We've got significant cost
Right.
for having lost that person. And in a sense, now we have to backfill two jobs, right? Because there was a sales job and now we got to replace that person. So even though there might be a little bit longer time to productivity to move internally, it's the smart thing to do from a cost perspective, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. Peter Block said, resistance is fear made manifest.
Mhm.
And so the organization might have some fears about losing a clinical role who's at the bedside of the patient going into a sales role. But your data, again, our data showed us that once they get into that sales and growth role, our business grew. And the return was more than enough to pay for that extra structure that we put around helping those folks move into that role and attracting new clinicians into the organization. So um, uh, data. I think you can prove the ROI of why it's much less costly to replace both of those roles or one of those roles. The average nurse years ago cost $60,000 to replace. Um, if I can improve my sales by 1%, and that's a seven-figure number, I'm okay with a couple of nurses being moved over into my growth group.
So the other thing that we talk a lot about, again, with just this development opportunity, and I'm gonna broaden that out a little bit into this concept of upskilling. So one of the things that we hear a lot about is that the current workforce doesn't have the skills that are going to be necessary, say 5, 10 years from now, as companies continue to innovate, as more, things like AI come into the equation. In healthcare, and I just use that as an example, continue to see electronic medical records and things that didn't exist. And I think that's an older issue at this point. But it is important to continue to upskill your organization. How do you think companies need to look out to the future and seeing what is going to be necessary and how are we going to help our workforce get to that place?
Yeah, I would stay in tune with what's happening.
Hmm.
A number of us are in the HR profession. If you look at some of the articles and research out there, that's one of many roles that we think are going to look vastly different because of the technology coming into play these days. So one, upskill ourselves. You know, go take that Python class that you never in the world would have imagined taking as an HR professional. Expose yourself to it at least, and start to be reading business journals, be reading trends out there from a technology perspective. Get ourselves in touch from an HR perspective, and that's going to help us help our businesses be prepared for that future. Realistically, we'll never get it 100%, but it's really back to that earlier point we made, Danny. Get progress over perfection. Maybe you plan 18 months out for now, because I think our knowledge is increasing at such a pace, doubling every, less than a year now. Um, that's hard to keep pace with, but start, and don't feel like you have to be the expert in everything.
So Kevin, it's probably going to feel a little self-serving, and I apologize for the audience for this, but we're real believers in live learning environments, right? Learning together, getting groups of people together and learning, especially, regardless of whether it's management training or leadership development, or even in this upskilling environment, that when we get people together, it actually stimulates the learning in pretty fascinating ways. But yet I also see companies in this upskilling environment um, using online learning significantly. And they think you mentioned, university, company universities, but I see a lot of company universities that are built around online learning. And I don't want to say that online learning isn't okay. There are good things about it. It makes it very accessible for those people that are driven to go consume new information. But we also see a lot of times it's not being utilized. So from
Mhm.
that perspective, like, how do we find ways to bring people together, potentially, if you agree with that? Or how do we make sure, if we're using online tools, that we are getting utilization? How do we get people really to do the things that, we think they need to do, but ultimately they need to do, and sometimes leave because they think it's not available? That's probably a four-pronged question, but so my apologies, but I think you know where I'm going.
I'll wing it and probably answer half of what you asked. So, folks, feel free to hit that Q&A button. So help me out.
Absolutely.
Um, is 100% online learning appropriate for every organization? I would say no. Are there some basic things that we can teach that way? Sure. Yeah, we can teach policies 101 on an online format. You don't need to be in a room having kumbaya together to learn that you have to enforce your absence policy. However, uh, I'll give you an example. In a recent organization, we took our entire budget that we had for developing our senior most leaders and took that and invested in our frontline managers.
Wow.
Because what our data was telling us is that those frontline managers were turning over well over 50%. Well, you can imagine, as an employee, if my boss is changing, I got a 50% chance that the boss who hired me is going to be gone in the next 12 months. That creates a lot of instability in your culture. Uh, and so we took that data, changed that investment approach, and brought people in person. Um,
Mhm.
and particularly think of a manager's role versus an employee's role. A manager's role is 95% managing the other humans on their team, and that's a completely different skill set than the individual contributor role. It makes me think of Leadership Pipeline, that book. You make that turn to start leading others, you're going to have human interaction to be able to offer corrective action, or to be able to offer feedback, or to be able to help an employee with goal setting. That, to me, that requires in-person practice. Um, and really, it's the oldest training system in the world. It's called apprenticeship. There's a reason it has survived all these times. We still train our medical doctors that way,
Mhm.
because putting your hands on the patient um, is very different, and interacting with the patient is very different than taking an online class. So I think it's always going to be a blend going forward. We're going to have some things that are very appropriate online, but if you can allocate your resources in such a way that particularly your leaders are getting in-person experience to practice skill sets, their ability to retain that information will improve.
Okay. I want to move along to equipping managers to guide career growth. One of the premises we've had for quite a number of years now is that well, one thing we know is that managers are taking on more and more responsibility, and a lot of that responsibility is not related to actually managing people. But one of the things that we feel that's missing is that our managers aren't actually being developed to have those career conversations, to really be a good guide for their team and those team members to actually see the career opportunities in companies. So, are you seeing any trend at all, or need? And what do you see as the need for? How do we help managers to be better at promoting careers, at being able to be good? I call them career coaches. I think they need to be career coaches. So what are your thoughts around that?
I've certainly seen it improve over the
Okay.
last several years. Folks are realizing that you're even seeing it in performance management systems where we move away from a 5 point scale to really a coaching model where I'm helping, Danny's my boss. He's helping me. Kevin, you're doing these two or three things right. Here's this one area where you can start to improve. And so that evolution to a coaching model, a career coach model of, if you want to advance in the organization, what I've noticed is these three things are really important skills to have. So I'm going to help you as projects come up by assigning you to things that might grow those skills, or you may want to seek out those things, through learning and development or through volunteering for projects, so on and so forth. So we haven't gotten it right yet, but I am seeing more and more of that approach of a coach rather than a sort of an enforcer of rules in the manager role.
Or even just the idea of saying go see HR, right? you
Yeah,
know,
precisely.
which
Yeah.
which is not the worst answer in the world. At least there's some admission of you need some new information and you need guidance. And so HR a lot of times can provide that guidance. So I'm not saying that's the worst answer, but I think especially in disparate organizations where you've got, we call it high people, high facility. I got a lot of people in a lot of different places. A lot of times those conversations either happen in the moment, the water cooler kind of conversation sometimes. But then we've also seen the adding the stay interview concept in a lot of cases. And that stay interview really is, I mean, it's about retention, about identifying risk, but it is very much a coaching and development conversation, at least in its origination, sort of how it's been talked about.
Yeah, one of the organizations I worked with, we made it formal in terms of a structure. So we added a quarterly check-in with your leader that was only focused on career development.
Okay.
So we just formalized that as a structure within the organization. So of course, your performance conversation is a different conversation. Your weekly or bi-weekly one-on-ones is different. But we made it measurable that leaders were having quarterly interactions that were only focused on the development of the employee, and that structure helps. And I think that's our role from an HR perspective, to help add some of those structures and accountabilities to make sure those conversations are happening.
And I want to move on to let you give us a sort of a couple more real life examples. But I talk about continuous improvement, and I think there's a couple of things here that you've already mentioned. Like, what are those regular check-ins? So I think we need to be having regular check-ins with employees that are career oriented. And number two, we talk about adjusting based on employee feedback. And I appreciate the fact, Kevin, that you've mentioned several times, follow the data, get the data, right? And whether that's data is coming through some sort of annual survey, whether that's coming through exit interviews, whatever we have in terms of being able to create um, to have data that tells us, and I even think you made a great point. A lot of times I think about the data as employee feedback, but even just looking at the natural career movement that comes out of our, HCM system is not unimportant. So I appreciate both those things. I wanted to say, and I think you've answered this, but in terms of kind of a real world example, you know, I think you've already mentioned it, but what are those signals that career development was a concern? What were you hearing? And before we go there, I think I did see one.
Yeah, I
I
just
saw a
noticed that.
question come through. Got a question here. Would you agree that career coaching is a professional skill? That career coaching an is in nature neutral and with high need for trust. And I think managers could do career facilitation, those informal conversations at the water cooler you talked about. So not sure I'm completely understanding it, but I think what I was getting at is that we do need to be teaching our managers how to be career coaches so that it is more of a professional skill.
And I agree, Leslie, that we're not great at it and equipping our managers with that. And is there some skill to it? For sure. Is it based on trust and relationships with your employees? Absolutely. That's the core of it, to where it becomes more of a, to your point, a facilitator conversation. Hey, what's important to you? What kinds of work gives you energy? Really think of the ICF coach model, where you are just simply facilitating the answers from the employee, and then that gives you the information to help them point them in the right direction within the organization to develop those skills. So I'd say, professional skill, heavy one, not necessarily, but with some light touch and structure from us as an HR support team, yeah, we can absolutely help refine that with our leaders.
Leslie, thanks so much for the question. So Kevin, getting back to my question, so what were some of those signals that career development was a concern? How did you, and then again, I think you've sort of touched on that, but obviously you have to garner support. You have to garner support from the C-suite. You have to garner support from operational managers. So how did you do those things in terms of being able to actually start putting career strategies in place?
Yeah, again, just implore you to partner with a work institute or similar organization from a listening strategy standpoint. So in some of my examples, Work Institute was the partner, and others it was not. But it was really about that listening strategy and understanding why people are really leaving the organization, or why folks are really highly or not highly engaged in the organization. So that definitely was the approach. I'm an HR analyst. That was my first job in HR, and that's just sort of shaped me in my career ever since. If you can't measure it, it's not going to move. It's the Kevin Richie philosophy. Not always true, but largely true. So in the call center setting, that's a high turnover environment by its very nature. And if you are in a call center business, very often you're in cities and towns where there are other companies with call centers, because that's where the skill set is. So in that one, our data was telling us that's why folks were leaving. They were seeing competitors with completely different purposes for their call centers, but they had career pathing. They had other professional development opportunities that we were not able to offer initially. So that's when we started doing that study of how can people move. I had a very personal example in my team. We had a supervisor of one of the call center teams attend one of our training. It was sort of a 101. Hey, if you're thinking about growing in the organization, here's some basic 101 leadership skill classes. So we were offering that generically across some of the call centers. One of the supervisors was really dynamic, gave some really articulate answers in the class. We realized, gosh, this guy might be a great trainer. Lo and behold, we brought him on our team, and he was a fabulous trainer. So definitely hearing that in the data, and then doing something about it and making it more formal to that arrows graphic of, hey, one of the paths you can take is from call center representative to supervisor to learning and development lead, because our data was showing that was a real viable path. So hear the data, see the data, do something about the data. In the clinical example, it's really that nursing ladder. If you think of a vertical ladder, that's really a competency improvement ladder, as opposed to I'm a supervisor, manager, director, and so forth. That we tied with some financial incentives. So if you went from your ASN to your BSN, there was a financial reward for that. And you had to do projects that benefited the organization and our patients. And then same for BSN to MSN to get to that next level of the ladder. And then we build incentives like, hey, your badge should look different if you climb that ladder. Nurses love, the tenure pins, and they love the badge recognition of how they've improved and grown their skill set. So there's some not so costly things that you can do besides base pay or incentives that show people are growing.
So I want to go back again to this whole idea of garnering support, because I feel like as HR professionals, and I'm a recovering one still, I think, we feel like we know what needs to be done, but somehow we struggle to sell it to the organization. We struggle to get support for our efforts. And obviously this could go across the board in terms of so many things we're trying to do, but it seems like career pathways and career development should be an easy one. But you've said it a million times already, you use the data, but are there other things that might be important? I think about it as looking at it through a cost of turnover lens, right? That's going to be one of the ways that you may garner more support from operations and from the C-suite. But what other things do you think you have to do in order to garner that support, if anything?
Totally agree with your points on that, Danny. I think what I would add is build relationships with key people in the organization. My most successful implementations, I had garnered support from multiple members of the senior team before I ever went to the meeting where they were all in the room together to approve or deny the initiative. So, how to win friends and influence people, Carnegie. It's really about building your trust and relationships as a professional with those in the decision-making roles. And you do that with data. You do that with anecdotal things. Hey, I just lost this key nurse in this department who was critical to the culture of that team because she went to an organization that had a career ladder. Felt like she'd not been recognized in years here. Those are powerful stories. And if you can take your information and your data and turn it into a very personal story like that, you're going to get a lot farther in terms of your ability to move those initiatives.
Good deal. Again, I'd like to invite anyone. I think there may be an issue with the Q&A for some folks. Feel free to use the chat button as well if you've got a couple of questions for Kevin and I, because I want to wrap things up here pretty quick. Kevin, I don't think career development is optional anymore. I think we have to be able to invest in this. I mean, we're seeing it again. And to some degree, it's not that this 20% is necessarily going to go away. One of the things that I think is important for organizations from a data perspective is we do see, leaving for career reasons as being preventable. And if we can somehow even shift in our organization, even if our turnover doesn't go down, but if we start to move things from more preventable to less preventable, regrettable to non-regrettable, kinds of things, I think that's something we have to be paying attention to. And I think that this is the career, these career issues are one of those things, right? That we've got to be moving the needle on it. And I think we've got to do more right now.
Yeah, it hugely communicates that you care.
Yeah.
And feeling cared about is a really basic human need. And these career ladders show folks that you care about their growth and development, you care about challenging them, and hugely agree. The only other thing I would mention, Danny, is do something, move something, start small, be okay with imperfection. Work Institute, if you think of them as this partner in terms of engagement. So this is my selfish plug for you, even though I'm not employed by Work Institute. they have a number of partners like me who have helped organizations with work like this. So if you've got that need, you've got the data. Work Institute's one of the best in the country, in my opinion, of having those human interactions with those folks that are leaving your organization and telling their stories. If you've got a need for it and just need an external set of eyes to kind of push it forward a bit, by all means, pick up the phone. Danny and his team can help. And they've got a network of folks like me who can help. And I would just encourage you to do so. What's not okay is sitting still. Organizationally, that's your opportunity for death. So if you're not moving forward, you're dying. And career pathing is huge. I've had other data partners, and I've always seen I agree with Danny. It hasn't always been number one with those other partners, but it's always been in the top three: career pathing, growth, and development.
Well, and I since you made a plug for Work Institute, I'll make a small one here, and that is that, our exit interviews are, I mean, we're a little old school, and I almost hate to use that term because I don't think it's old school. It's just, we still just simply ask people why they left, and that opens up to let them be really authentic about why it is they're leaving the organization. And we're not trying to just give them a list of here are 6 things to choose from, or here's 12 things to choose from, because there's inherent bias in giving them and saying, here's your choices. We actually have like 50 different reasons for leaving, that we categorize things into. And I think when people can articulate for themselves, and you've said it, Kevin, their own story, in more of a qualitative interview, I think it's important. And typically they'll tell an outside third party things they won't tell the HR person or their manager or other folks. So I think that's really important. So
I'm
Kevin,
going to
thanks
push
so.
back. I'm going to push back and say you're not old school. You've
Good.
remained human centered.
I love that term. I love that term. Thank you for that. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for doing this today. I really appreciate it. I hope our audience has taken something away from this. Again, we've tried to do something a little different with these webcasts, not just, kind of a lecture type thing, trying to bring some other experts into the conversation. I know Kevin's available on LinkedIn. He's easy to find if you want to have a conversation with Kevin. He's got his own consulting practice he's working with right now. If you need to get to Kevin, you can go through us, obviously. But I'd also invite you to join us next week. We're going to talk about managers as a linchpin to employee retention. There's a QR code on your screen, so you can actually get to registration for that. This one's going to be really important because managers are sitting at the core of the retention strategy. And we've got, not only do they have to be good career coaches, but we've got to be addressing other things. So, Kevin, thanks again. Appreciate it. Any final thoughts?
Great to be with you all. Enjoyed it, and wish you much success in your endeavors, everyone. Do career pathing. You won't regret it.
Yeah, 100%. Kevin, thanks so much. Again, we thank everybody for joining us. Hopefully we'll see a lot of you next week. Take care. Have a great day.
Take care.